quick preamble before we get into the actual analysis. Tournament War Room, I would expect it to come out on Tuesday up until me and Jay Doza finish with the LRA. That should be, he told me it's running through June, so maybe the next 2 months or so. Expect this to come out on Tuesday, simply because I'm doing casts Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and it's just easier for me to work on these Monday after my cast rather than Sunday night, because Sunday night I'm, kind of debriefing from my work week and doing the casting and compiling the data for this. So for the foreseeable future, the next 2 months, expect these on Tuesday, and expect them weekly, depending on if the meta isn't super solved. If it's super solved, I'll probably tell you on Friday if we're not having a war room, but Tuesdays. Alright, so obviously patch 2.4 got solved pretty quickly. This is Duels of Shurima. This happened 2 weeks after the release of Shurima, about 10 days actually, so, not opening weekend, but immediately after, and then TF Fizz obviously took over the top 4, the lineup, as me and Jadoza like to call it, the tier 1 decks on my tier list, really came out pretty quickly as just a dominant factor, and then OLS number 22 and the LOR Global Tournament Series happened very near the end of patch 2.4, I think it was one of the last weekends, and they happened in the same weekend, so as you can see, obviously TF is and Shenfiora, the 2 most popular decks in both of them, though there's a big fall off in the Tournament Global Series. But as you can see, for the most part, the top end of the meta is relatively the same, and then it just kind of gets down to what are the one-ofs that you're going to be seeing in events like these. Frostbite Midrange had a random higher presence here, but I did want to show you that the top end of these tournaments is relatively the same, so that you understand that what I'm about to show you for the opening weekend of patch 2.5 is so startling. Now we had 2 different tournaments, the Twin Suns Podcast Tournament, which had a top 16, and the OLS number 23, which had a top 8. Despite this, things look pretty different, and I'll have a regional breakdown for that. I didn't have it here just because Aphelios Temple was kind of a crapshoot. You see Targon X, some of them were Bilgewater, some of them were Shadow Isle. I don't have these lists available still, so I didn't remember. It doesn't really matter anyway. Let's get into what happened last weekend. So this is the data from the patch 2.5 opening weekend, April 4th and 3rd and 4th. April 3rd and 4th. As you can see, things are very different on both sides. I even included a regional breakdown here. Now, the numbers don't line up very clean because the Twin Suns tournament had a top 16 and the OLS only had a top 8. But as you can see, even the top end of these tournaments was very different. OLS was obviously a lot of one-ofs, but the big takeaway is kind of what you expected in that there were 3 Lee Sin and Lysandra, and then 3 Nightfall, Aggro, and Spiders. So about a 50-50 split on Lee Sin versus Aggro. That's kind of what we were expecting for the opening weekend. Before players can really refine what a good lineup looks like, what is a deck that is exploitable and popular enough to exploit. For example, I know a lot of players talk about Lysandra. You can build a 3-deck lineup that's going to beat Lysandra. The question has always been, is Lysandra popular enough for you to do that and top a tournament? And the answer still seems to be no. It's really hard to run a counter lineup week 1, so, by the seasonal, I'm sure we'll have a counter lineup. We'll have decks that we are sure are popular enough for you to run something like that. So on the opening weekend, we're just kind of feeling out what works, what doesn't, and with a 50-50 split on Lee Sin and Aggro, we haven't figured out anything. This is what we expected. The LRA and LBR are happening here Monday and Tuesday, and then going into Duels of Shurima this weekend, that's when we'll really start to get to hone in on, how things are actually shaking out. But that's only 2 weeks before the seasonal, so it is really sketchy. I'm going to keep the analysis coming for you guys. Now, on the side of the Twin Suns podcast, this is where things got really interesting to me. Scouts was the most represented deck among their top 16. And as you can see here, this is one of the reasons that I did the regional breakdown. There was only one Demacia deck in the top 8 of the OLS number 23. Meanwhile, it was the most popular region for the Twin Suns podcast top 16. Now, I'm sure that there is a really cool deep dive that I could do into this, and I thought about going through every deck list of every player in the tournament and figuring out, was the meta landscape between these 2 tournaments so different that Demacia was able to thrive in one and not in the other? Was it... There's so many different things that it could be, and honestly, I didn't do it. It was going to take hours, and it's not worth it, especially because we'll probably figure it out next weekend when we have Duels of Shurima, as well as the top cut of the Twin Suns podcast. This one didn't actually play out yet, so I do want to mention that Triple Aggro did win the OLS, but it did come up against the Lee Sin Lysandra lineup in the finals, so those 2 top dogs are really 50-50 split on the OLS side of things. Now, As for the Twin Suns, why did it have so much more Demacia than the OLS? Why did the OLS have no Demacia? I think it really just kind of comes down to player preference. There's no specific factor that I can point to as to why there was so much more Demacia in one tournament than the other. That's the kind of thing that you track over the course of weeks, not just look at these two isolated tournaments and go, oh, obviously these guys were just on a different level. It's hard to say. They were both international events. They were both, for the most part, open to the public. They were both of relatively similar sizes. The Twin Suns had 80 players. The OLS had 120 something when all was said and done. So comparable sizes for sure. And it's once again a lot of aggro and a lot of Lee Sin Lissandra lineups, pretty close to a 50-50 split on the side of the Twin Suns tournament. Now, I don't really have any specific lists that I want to show you. You can check out my tier list for sample deck lists on a lot of these. I'll try to get them updated. Now, as for some of these one-ofs, I'm a little surprised that there was only one Draven Ezreal among both of the top cuts. I think that this is a very powerful anti-aggro deck that should still have a decent time against some of the non-aggro lineups as well. So Draven Ezreal is definitely my deck to watch going into next week. I think it was super underrated within these two tournaments. And you know me. If you've watched my content, you know I am not a fan of Draven Ezreal, but I do think that in this meta, it's definitely got some space to come up and really start to do its thing. Now, most impressive aggro deck, I think that Scouts and Nightfall were really the two that kind of surprised me in turn. Well, not surprised me, but really came out as the top dogs and the ones that I think I would cement as the best aggro decks going forward. Scouts obviously has always been able to play aggro against the decks that don't handle aggro well, and then play a more mid-range game against the aggro decks. And, similarly to how Draven Ezreal does it. So I think that like Draven Ezreal and Scouts are actually pretty comparable in terms of play style, and I really like the way that these decks play into the meta that we've got here. And then Nightfall just came out, Doom Beast hosing all of the aggro decks, Unto Dusk proving to be a very powerful tool for a deck like that. So I think that these are sort of the three decks to watch for an aggro lineup going forward. I don't know if you'd put Draven Ezreal in an aggro lineup, but if you want to be able to out aggro things and then still beat the aggro decks, I think that a lineup like Draven Ezreal, Nightfall, and Scouts is actually something that I'd be really interested in exploring a little bit more. Other decks that are coming up really big is the not only Shen Demacia, but Asol Demacia. Really just, it's so weird that there was no Demacia in the OLS. It was just the one Demacia deck, and it was, that single Asol Demacia. I think this is a deck that is going to be refined going forward, because right now it's really just kind of an anti-aggro pile. I thought that it was going to be Grand Plaza, maybe even with Invoke, but that's not the case. They are going for, the Screeching Dragon, some players even going for that pseudo-dragon build with the Dragon Guard Lieutenant, and really just playing a super anti-aggro style of gameplay. And that handles certain types of aggro well and others not so well. And it kind of depends on the hands. But basically, I've dropped the categories of aggro into two different options. We've got the 12-1 drop aggro and the mid-rangey aggro. And you can argue about the decks that I put in here. Draven Ezreal, maybe you don't call it an aggro deck. Maybe you do. It doesn't really matter. For the purposes of this discussion, like Discard is falling into 12-1 drop aggro because it has similar matchup charts, despite the fact that it doesn't actually play 12-1 drops like Spiders and Pirates. This is mostly going to be like Noxus aggro and non-Noxus aggro, if that makes sense, with Zerlution being a little bit of an outlier here, but it plays in a similar gas out, go fast, do the damage kind of style of play. So the 12-1 drop aggros have the option to actually out-aggro these Demacia Asol decks, because for the most part, they're not really getting online until about turn 4. Sure, they're not running Grand Plaza, but that's when they start to get down their Solari Sunforgers and their Fangs, and they're not really looking to kill you as much as they are just deplete you of resources while maintaining a healthy enough life total that you can't beat them. And then against these decks, these are decks that will not get going fast enough to ever smork out Asol Demacia before they get all their lifesteal online. And I think that's one of the reasons we're going to see a bigger rise in Asol Demacia, is because these are, some of the highest performing aggro decks. It was one of the most popular aggro decks in the OLS, and then the most popular aggro deck and deck in general in the Twin Suns tournament. And I think that Asol Demacia fares much better against these kinds of decks than the 12-1 drop aggro. The 12-1 drop aggro is going to do much better against something like Lee Sin. Lissandra's a little questionable, but Lissandra's typically what you're banning as one of the 12-1 drop aggro decks anyway, so, you don't have to take that dicey line of play. But I kind of wanted to give you guys a broad scope of what we're dealing with here, and I could talk for probably an hour about all the different implications, but at the end of the day, this is just one weekend, and it's opening weekend at that. There's so much more adaptation that's going to come out of these players over the course of the week, and I don't think I want to have like a 25-30 minute video this week that then most of it gets thrown out the window by the time we come to Tournament Tactician and Duels of Shurima happens, and we have a much better idea of what we're actually working with. So before I get off onto a crazy tangent, I think I'm going to cut myself a little short here and just leave you guys with the analysis that I have presented. So Demacia aggro, I think it was underrepresented in the OLS. I think it's going to continue to rise. A lot of players are really liking the Shen Demacia style of deck, and there's even big differences among that, because when I say Shen Demacia, I mean Shen Lulu, Shen Jarvan, or Shen Jarvan Lulu, and the differences between those two decks even was so big. Shen Lulu was coming out of the gate with 3 Relentless Pursuit and 2 Aegis among pretty much all of the competitors. The Shen Jarvan decks played so much more like Shen Fiora, where we kept in the River Shapers. You know, we've got the top ends with the Jarvan the thirds and the Jarvan the fourths, pretty much everybody net decking the BBG list. And then, you know, we've got players coming in with triple Lulu, 2 Shen, 1 Jarvan, and that's something that players are still experimenting with. It came out a lot in the LRA, a little bit in the LBR, if I remember correctly, but historically, triple champion decks don't last. It is just players kind of figuring out what is and isn't actually going to work. Go Hard has also made a little bit of a resurgence. That was in the LBR today. They are still a little bit of them on the triple aggro, or on the triple champion lineup, rather. I'd say triple, I think, aggro. I predicted that they were going to do Twisted Fate, Gangplank, and Kindred, but they're doing Twisted Fate, Gangplank, and Elise, kind of going back a little bit old school, but I'm not sure how good Go Hard's going to continue to be. Go Hard's pretty good against the 12 1-drop aggro. It kind of depends on how fearsome they are. That's another wrench that gets thrown in the works, right? Is like spiders are very fearsome heavy, as are Nightfall. Going into this weekend on Tournament Tactician, I talked about the kind of lineup that I would bring this weekend, and I had said that I would do Zoe Karma, Darspring, and Targon Plaza. Now the Targon Plaza, let's, for the sake of argument, say I meant Aesol Demacia. So with a lineup like this, I'd usually have a pretty good chance against a lot of aggro decks. The problem is that Starspring will handle some of the 1-drop aggro decks pretty well, and others not so well. They're very weak to fearsomes, and it was a misrepresentation on my part where you know, fearsome, the deck archetype, is not popular at all. Nobody is running mist rates, but there's so much more fearsome in the Spider and the Nightfall than I had anticipated. I probably would have gotten bodied this week, and my Starspring would have done absolutely nothing. It would have beaten all the Zoe, or all the Lee Sin players, but I think that Aesol Demacia probably would have gotten picked on by the Lee Sin players had I chosen not to ban that deck against them. It's kind of this weird triangle going on right now, even within Targon, where I feel like you have the Karma decks. Yeah, even within just the Targon regions themselves, like Karma, I think, beats Lee Sin beats Aesol, and then Aesol beats Karma. It just gets to out late game it. Lee Sin gets to out mid game the Aesol, and Karma gets to out late game the Lee Sin. So there are so many different triangles within the different kinds of lineups. It's not as black and white as Lee Sin versus aggro, because then when you have the Lee Sin lineups play against each other, you know, we get into situations like this where you have this matchup chart, and then when you have the aggro versus the aggro, there's another matchup chart over here, and I could go on and on about it, but as I had mentioned, I think I talked 5 minutes ago about cutting myself off. I just want to make you guys aware of the information that I have available, and this is the analysis that I have for now. I'm expecting to be a little bit more educated on the way that things are actually going to go going into Duels of Shurima this weekend, and once Duels of Shurima happens, then I will be much better situated to prepare you for the seasonal tournament, because that's what all of this is about. Once we got on to patch 2.5, we are full in on prep for the seasonal mode, so I don't want to laser focus you in on and tunnel you on what happened last weekend when there's so much more data that we're going to get to collect this weekend at Duels of Shurima, because that's a tournament name with pull. People are going to come back in, they're going to play in it. It's going to be a big one, definitely going to be over 100 players, and we'll have a much better idea of how the internal struggles of Targon, the internal struggles of aggro, and how the head-to-heads for them are actually going to end up going. So, and even outside of that, we haven't even gotten to touch on, you know, the Shen Demacia decks. Are they here to stay? Are they going to go away? It's a great question. Deep, it's popping back up a little bit. It was in both top cuts. You know, how much longer is that going to stick around? Draven Ezreal, where does it fall in? There are so many questions that I don't have the answers for, and it would be disingenuous for me to try to do it, and it wouldn't even matter that much, because if I get some of it wrong, it'll be fixed by Friday anyway when I have a little bit more information. But I am really excited for Duels of Shurima and for the next tournament War Room to have a much clearer picture of what this meta is going to look like. So I am going to cut myself off here before I talk myself into a hole, because I think, I don't know if I've edited it out, but I've said I was going to end this 3 times, and I will get back to you on Friday with Tournament Tactician, hopefully with more information and a better idea of what we're actually getting ourselves into for the seasonal tournament. After Duels of Shurima, I will have a much clearer picture, and then the week before the seasonal, I will have an even better one, as we will have the Jason Florent and Majin Bay $1,000 tournament alongside the OLS, probably. Not 100% sure on that one. Everybody's trying to get out of everybody's way and make sure that the communities can just have the best tournaments that they can. So, I will leave you with this. I will get back to you on Friday with Tournament Tactician. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. As always, good luck in your tournaments.